Many of you might be asking the question, why am I addicted? Why me? How did this happen to me? Why do I have this problem? Why can't I just use this drug I love and not be addicted? What contributes to me being this way? Well, as I might have alluded to before, it's not a moral thing. You're not a good person or a bad person because you use drugs. You're not a good person or a bad person because you're addicted to heroin or Percocets or Vicodins or any of the opiates that you might have a particular attachment to. But there are reasons that might have predisposed you to have this type of behavior that leads you to forsake your personal and professional relationships just to use a drug. And the basic way that I'll break it down is I'll break it down to some biological kind of family history, genetic perspective. There's certainly a biological contribution to addiction. We see it in family lineages, we see it in genetic studies, we see it across an array of different substances to be addicted to, and there's without a doubt a connection that if you have family members, if you have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents that were addicted to not necessarily the same thing you're addicted to, it doesn't even have to be necessarily a drug. It could have been gambling. It could have been sex, although that's much smaller addiction than people try to lead you to think. That is definitely a big contribution to why you might be having this problem. That's the biological. The other, that's probably just as important from a biological link, is the correlation between mental health and addiction. And certainly if you have bipolar family members in your family history, and if you have bipolar grandparents and so on, that's a big player. Another one is, well, look, if everyone around you is using, and that's how you grow up, if you saw drugs everywhere, if there's drugs in your community, if your parents and uncles or friends are using, then it's not so difficult to imagine how drugs became part of your repertoire, how heroin became part of your social network. I think it's even fair to say that if you had a lot of sick relatives that you took care of and you saw their bottles and bottles of opiate medicines because they had cancer, and here you are dealing with all the stress of taking care of them. Plenty of stories I've heard of that being the beginning for many, many people where, they knew that it's something that they shouldn't take, they knew that it could make them feel good, and hey, they have all these bottles, all these unused bottles of painkillers that they got from their sick relative, and they're the ones dealing with the stress anyway. If anything, I've even heard this said, I probably needed it more than they did. And I'm not even saying that that's not exactly true. It might have even been true. But there's a big risk when that becomes the behavior, because these medications and heroin and the list of opiates that you could use are so powerful that the changes that they implement in the brain are not temporary. You didn't just affect the brain during the time that you felt the high. You affected the brain way after the time that you felt the high. You're affecting the brain when you feel the withdrawal. You're affecting the brain when you're craving. The brain takes much longer to readjust from the effects than is typically thought of with these drugs or any substance. So just because the high was a few hours doesn't mean that the effects on the brain went away with the high. And that's something that is unfortunately not understood. And people think that as soon as they stop using, well, that should be that and their brain should go back to where it was, and that doesn't happen. And specifically with opiates, that certainly doesn't happen.